Welcome. What I will say here is you could describe it as a lament for the Canadian church. My attention is often turned to the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations in these dark days as not only churches but individual Christians struggle with many challenges and wrestle with many questions that pertain to their faith and life and how their faith should be lived out in this world. And as I advance my argument to the end of this, what you'll see especially is that I'll be bringing out the first and the second tables of the law from Exodus 20, verse 1 to 17. Now, of course, that is more simply stated as the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments are split up into two parts. The first table of the law focuses on the call to love God. That covers Commandments 1 to 4. And then the second table of the law focuses on the command to love your neighbor, which is Commandments 5 to 10. So I have a letter here in my possession from the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. And they gave me this letter responding to a letter that I sent them, and it is dated for June 15, 2005. So this is a 16-year-old letter from the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General. It is part of my correspondence with them over Bill C-38, the Civil Marriage Act. This act was meant, as they say in there, to extend legal capacity to marry for civil purposes to same-sex couples while respecting religious freedom. In my letter, I joined a lot of Canadians, and especially Canadian Christians, in expressing concern to the courts as it was being processed. I expressed concern that this would lead to religious persecution against Christians. In response, they firmly assured me that, and I quote again, religious groups will remain free to follow their beliefs and make their own decisions about what marriage is within those beliefs, and that no religious officials will be forced to perform marriages that are contrary to their beliefs. So very heavy emphasis on Christians still being allowed to practice what they believe. They focused heavily on human rights for a little over 3 pages, as you see here. They wrote a 3-page letter, 4-page letter, and then they also gave me various articles of information on the human rights nature of the bill that was being put through. So they focused very heavily on human rights, and they concluded with an expression of appreciation that they had the opportunity to communicate with young Canadians like me. So my parents encouraged me to keep the letter for later reference, and that's why I still have it here today. And I am now analyzing it as a 28-year-old pastor who is looking upon a host of issues for the Canadian church. And for Canadian Christians as we seek to live our faith and confess our Savior. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was known in the late 1900s for tying in the human rights violations in Russia, especially in the gulags, to a rejection or at least a forgetfulness of God. He spoke and he wrote, "Men have forgotten God. That is why all this has happened." And as I read through the response of the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General to me 16 years ago, it is striking that there is no reference to God. Do not human rights flow from the God who has given human rights? There's a lot of talk about charter rights and freedoms, but doesn't our charter rights and freedoms begin with these words, and I quote, "Whereas Canada is founded on principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law." I remember the stir in the Christian community at the time that Bill C-38 was in the courts. There were letter-writing campaigns. Many have now moved on to a new day and a new fight. Various other bills have also now received our concern. Bill C-7 is now law, and Bill C-6 is almost law. Of all these bills, Bill C-6 most clearly undermines religious freedom in Canada. Now, Bill C-6 undermines certain religious freedoms and that ability for Christians to express their beliefs in positive, productive ways. But there are other bills that also violate human rights and begin to detract from that real understanding of what human rights are. Canada now has some of the loosest abortion laws and the most open euthanasia laws in the world. As much as we all disagree and maybe even condemn many of the inhumane forms of conversion therapy, it appears that Bill C-6 is now so broad that pastoral counseling and preaching will also soon be targeted. So it's a very broad bill and will also target pastoral counseling and preaching. In other words, religious freedom will no longer be respected. And it's sad. It's actually terrible to see how someone's depressed daughter can walk into a hospital and get killed or get gender reassignment surgery. And when you see that, you know that something is terribly wrong. And so there are a host of human rights violations happening right now. And of course, Christians are called to do what we can for truth, mercy, and righteousness, seeking justice, loving mercy, walking humbly with God. We speak to many issues that relate to the second table of the law. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not lie. And the church must continue to be that prophetic voice, calling men and women away from sin and misery to faith in Jesus Christ, to new life, to that new creation that's found in Jesus Christ. But what is going wrong? As we move to the close, I want to focus more on the first table of the law. You shall have no other gods before the living God. You shall not make a graven image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall honor the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I have heard people say with regards to the restrictions on worship in the last year, well, let us wait to take a stand until Bill C-6 and Bill C-7 comes along. Those issues are clearer issues. Of course, the Canadian church has been saying things like that since I was 12 years old. And so in this, when these challenges, when these questions are brought up, what is the wisest way how to do things? What is the best way? What do we have to focus on? There are a number of questions that bombard my mind. Have we severed the second table of the law from the first? To put it in New Testament language, have we separated love for neighbor and love for God and maybe even made such a wide divide between the two of them that they are now in two different categories? Have we as well forgotten God and his supremacy over all things? And I ask this question. We are willing to stand for second table issues, and that is a good thing, but shouldn't we also stand for first table issues, especially in the church, especially in how we do things as a Christian community of believers, serving one another and serving God? We speak out now on second table issues, murder, adultery, etc. But what about divine worship? What about that call to worship the living God? Currently, Canadian leaders are discussing removing certain legal protections for Christian worship in the criminal code. It's happening. A government that no longer removes every obstacle from divine worship, so removing hindrances, and in fact even goes on to remove protections for divine worship, will also no longer remove every obstacle from the preaching of the gospel, and they will also go on to remove protections for the preaching of the gospel. Men will then become confused on the nature of murder. What is murder then? What is marriage? What is gender? When there is no recognition that there is one true God whose name and worship must be honored. When God is rejected, the concept that man is made in his image is also rejected. If there is no God, then man is not made in the image of God. So there's no basis for understanding who man is. No bedrock, no foundation. Such a nation that forgets God will become guilty of the grossest human rights violations because they forget in whose image man is made. Such a church that forgets God will announce peace where there is no peace, and their collapse will be great. And so I will conclude my lament in this way. Read through the entirety of Psalm 11, and you'll see how the psalmist concludes the first half with these words in verse 3. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? But he also answers that question in verse 4. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes see, his eyelids test the children of men. He is still sovereign. He is still supreme over all things. Even when there's so much wickedness and turmoil on earth, he is still sovereign. He is still supreme in the heavens. It is then that we also hear Hosea's call to return to the Lord, also within our context, within the world that we live in. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us, that he may heal us. He has struck us down, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us press on to know the Lord. His going out is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. Thank you.